And there you go. You can have the pointer.
Muchas gracias.
De nada.
All right.
You can go back.
I can. Voila. Okay, so hello, hola, hola. Hablaré en inglés en esta presentación, pero he pensado, gracias Víctor, pero he pensado que quizás pudiera comenzar con el español, al menos. Y gracias, Víctor, por la introducción. Gracias por los bienvenidos. So I will switch to English now, and probably I will keep speaking English until the end. Nice to see you all here. I hope that the topic of doing game studies in different languages, and indeed to some extent doing scholarship in the social sciences and humanities in different languages overall, not just game studies, will be something that that we can all find something for one of us here, like Victor said. We'll see. So I've recently learned that Football Club Barcelona won a victory 2-1 against Seville maybe 10 days ago, or maybe a week ago, and the Polish player Robert Lewandowski scored one of the goals. So given the fact that last year I went to Seville for a game studies conference in June, it all looks like a strange coincidence, but we've already established with some people today that game studies is a small world, so why not include the football part in this small world of game studies? Football is a game after all, so it should make sense. And so the conference took place in June, roughly 1 year ago, in mid-June last year. And to me personally, it was important because I was able to meet people from various places of the world doing game studies and talking about how game studies was being done in Chile, for example, or in South Korea, or in there were people from the Nordic countries like Finland, there were people from many countries, including the ones that hadn't been very well represented of the game studies scene so far. So it was nice to see those people, to listen to the presentations. I remember one paper by Maria Regina Mills, I think, a paper about Latinx game, what makes a Latinx game. Latinx meaning people of Latin American descent living, working, staying in the United States. And this was somewhat similar to what I was talking about this morning with regard to national video games. But for right now, I want to focus on the game studies part. So it seemed to me that it was a significant spot, a significant place, a significant step to take for people from various places of the world doing game studies in various languages. And of course, we communicated in English. And it's like Victor said at the beginning, English could be an international language, and it could be then used for communication between people presenting different languages, of course. But English could also be a hegemonic language or dominating language. And I've been talking about English and other languages too, with the inclusion of this power hierarchy thing, of this thing where some languages can get occluded or marginalized by others. I've posted the slides on my website, so if you somehow manage to type my Polish name into your browsers, you'll be able to find the slides there, or I can send them to you by email or anything. They are there, and if you want to share the slides or tweet anything, please feel free to do so. So that's the technicalities. I should probably now take a deep breath for you to be able to take a photo of the website thing. And at any rate, So now we are here 1 year after the conference in Seville, and I still haven't learned how to use the pointer. So why talk about this subject? Why talk about doing game studies in different languages? Why can it be important? Several years ago, with two colleagues, we did a talk at one of game studies conferences that didn't eventually turn into a paper, but we coined the name reflective term in game studies, and we thought that we were noticing a movement in game studies, at least in the Anglo sphere, but also in the Polish sphere of game studies, toward meta-reflection, toward game studies reflecting upon itself. And it seems that this movement or trend is still with us. People are writing stuff about various things related to game studies. Here are some examples, and I've taken 4 different examples from 4 different languages. So we start with the German reference I mentioned before. So here it is: interdisciplinäre Zugänge zu digitalen Spielen und so weiter. And then we have ćwierć wieku polskich badań nad grami wideo, and then we have game studies next level, Nuevos Horizontes para una disciplina emergente, and then we have discipline in games, and all these works are examples of how people are interested in the status of game studies, in the history of game studies, in power relationships in game studies, inequalities, and so on. So when I want to talk about the uses of languages in game studies and the relations between languages, the broad context for that is other discussions about various kinds of power relationships in the field. And at the bottom of the slide, there is a link to a bibliography I am compiling on the internet with works about game studies, mostly in English, but I hope there will be more non-English English works list too. So that's one context, what's being done in game studies. Specifically, there are perspectives related to various facets of equality, if you will, or diversity. One paper is about regional game studies, so we can call it geographical diversity. Another example is on post-colonialism. Yet another example is about the feminist perspective. Yet another example is about queer game studies. And I see the issue of languages in game studies as an issue of diversity also, because we use diverse languages in this room. We use several diverse languages, and it seemed to me last year, and I guess still seems to me to some extent, that languages in game studies are this elephant in the room. So it's there. Everyone who has been to a game studies conference in English, or almost everyone, has been influenced by these power relationships between languages, but we don't talk about it that much, or we don't publish that much about it. There are some exceptions, I will name 2. So in 2021, a paper was published in the journal Games and Culture, and a significant part of the paper was a report from a small study the authors had conducted. A part of that description was about perpetuating Anglocentrism, and the paper says that the demographics of the author's study reflect the perpetuating Anglocentrism of game studies. And the paper also says that there are countries that hold institutional power for academic research, for game-related disciplines and career opportunities. So it's important to stress here that it's not just about language, it's not just about the languages that are being used, but it's also about which languages are tied up to what power structures. So in a number of countries, if you publish in English, you are more likely to get recognized in academia. Your university is more likely to award you additional funds, or more likely to commend you, or more likely to give you a good internal evaluation. And sometimes this is codified in research evaluation systems. So you get this many points for publishing in your national language, but you get that many points for publishing in English. Then again, English is not just one English. There are various circulations, if you will, in English. So there are journals that have high impact factor, high ratings of the Scopus rating, high places in the Scopus rating. There are journals that score lower, and there are also local journals that are internationalized, so to speak, in an ostensible manner. There is an article written by my colleagues in Poland about ostensible internationalization, about the phenomenon where journals, under the pressure of new guidelines from the ministry, did some things to look more international. So for instance, they provided English translations of their websites, or they invited people with affiliations from abroad to be members of editorial committees, but it did nothing in terms of the real operations of the journal, hence ostensible internationalization. So there are many Englishes, so to speak, or many ways to use English, and some of them are related to more power or more prestige than are others. And that's another example. Just very briefly, Aaron Trammell has written about the colonized work of English, as he calls it, with regard to the division between games and play. He says in the article that the English language, with its strong distinction between games and play, has affected the way that we do game studies internationally or around the world, and that this means that some things are being left behind or left out of the equation. So there are two examples, but overall, as I said, I think there is not that much discussion of the use of languages in published works. We're going to talk a little bit more about the English language, because it's extremely important, and discussions about the role of English, not just in academia, are extremely important. And of course, we are talking in English now. So, first of all, there are papers and statistics showing a big increase in the use of English, not just in the natural sciences or STEM fields, but also in the social sciences, in the humanities. This doesn't mean that every field has undergone precisely the same kind of change. There are some fields, like, say, history, where English doesn't have such a strong position as, say, in physics. But what might be important to note here is that it hasn't always been the case. Up to the mid-20th century, English wasn't nearly as powerful a language as it is right now, even in the natural sciences. So many chemists would write in German, Einstein would write his things in German, and so on. But now, of course, English is much more frequently used. It's a predominant language in many sectors in academia, and this comes with advantages and disadvantages, and we'll be talking about them in a moment. Well, I will be talking, but then we may be talking about it in the discussion phase. So that's an example of a paper from 20 years ago. The role of English in scientific communication, lingua franca, or Tyrannosaurus rex. So is the English language the common language, lingua franca, the language we can use, we can all use to communicate, or is it a monster that's devouring other languages? There are many metaphors that were used. The English language was called the Frankenstein of languages, and so on and so on. I'm not exactly sure why Frankenstein, because Frankenstein wasn't devouring things that much, but maybe I will dig deeper and find out. So that's an example of a paper from 20 years ago, and the discussion continues. I have written one paper about that, and it's published in a journal called Globalization, Societies, and Education. And parts of what I'll be saying now will be related to that paper. So that's a note. And when I mentioned the conference in Seville, I also described then a study based on interviews with Polish game scholars. And I will be drawing from some of the same quotations in slightly different ways that I used there. So that's source information. Regarding these interviews, these were 7 interviews with 4 men and 3 women. They were mostly conducted in May and June 2023, with some experienced researchers, some early career researchers. And I talked then to internationally active Polish scholars. So they were publishing internationally and or they were attending international conferences. This, of course, means that I don't have a good insight from these data into what more locally oriented scholars were thinking at the time. So this is just a part of the game studies scene in Poland. And the way I'm going to talk about these things now is that I will tell you a little about how the rising role of the English language is being criticized in general literature, so to speak. And then I move into examples from my interviews with Polish game scholars. And then I will do the same thing with the defenses, with the attempts to defend the English language. So that's the structure for the nearest time. Since we are in Spain, I thought I might use an example from Spain. And one of the researchers who authored that paper is actually from, or was then, from a university in Barcelona. There's a paper about history, and based on interviews, the authors explained that the interviewees often thought that the rising role of the English language meant a change in how research is being done. It meant a change in the working culture, and they largely perceived this as a foreign influence or external influence. So, for instance, they associated the rising role of English with a need to move from monographs to articles as a medium of publication. And that also meant that they couldn't work as long on the chosen topics as they would like, because they felt that there was more pressure for quick publication. That's an example of history in Spain, but you could see similar papers about various disciplines in various countries. Then a book from 1992 by an English-speaking linguist, Robert Phillipson. He used the name linguistic imperialism to describe the situation, not specifically in academia, although he also wrote about higher education or scholarly communication or research, especially later. But he wrote about the general situation of the English language and the way it could endanger other languages. That's probably one of the strongest formulations. Imperialism is a strong word, and maybe not as strong as Frankenstein or Tyrannosaurus Rex, but I think quite strong. And the same author also used later the term Englishization. So you could also say Anglicization, maybe, or Anglification. But I guess that Englishization is the version that might be used the most. And he used it to talk about situations where the English language is replacing other languages, pushing them to the margins. Here you have an example of the use of this term Englishization in a journal devoted to management studies. And you can see here, for instance, a fragment about a US-style scholarly monoculture. So that's also an example of the language that's being used by people who are criticizing the the rising role of English. Also, the rankings dominate, like the university international rankings dominated by United States universities are mentioned as a part of this Englishization process. So there's an example from management studies. Then an article from this year, it was published online in 2022, but this year is when the final version has come out. An article about putting English in its place, in the sense that, as the authors write, we tend to overestimate the weight of English language scholarly production. So they write that the databases we are using, for instance, to measure the amounts of publications in various languages, and that these databases often tend to be biased toward the English language. And this means that we can easily underscore the scale of the use of other languages. And you've noticed that I'm only showing you English language literature, which is, I suppose, another facet of the irony that we deal with when talking about these things internationally. One more. Now, there'll be two things from scholars with ties to Latin America. Anna Cristina Suzina, Library University London, but as I've said, she's writing about the Latin American situation also, based on her biographical experiences. She talks about, for instance, here I should really learn how to use the laser pointer, but it's too late. So she talks about the invisibility of Latin American scientific production in international academic publications. And this is somewhat similar to that thing from the previous slide about the databases not including the full extent of non-English language publications. And one other thing, I think one of the best titles that I've seen, The Geopolitics of Bad English. This is by Leandro Rodriguez Medina, an Argentinian author, political scientist, if I remember correctly. He studied in the UK. Now I'm forgetting whether he did his PhD in Oxford or in Cambridge, but one of these two institutions. He then wrote a book in English based on his PhD about the relationship between peripheral knowledge and knowledge systems and institutions and central systems, stronger, more powerful systems. One of the things he writes here is how it cost him a lot to translate his writings, or well, not translate it, but proofread it, I think. Of how it cost him to proofread his English writing, to bring it to the level that was acceptable for people in the United Kingdom. And the geopolitics of bad English is partly about the question, to what extent do we want to emphasize the quality of English? Let's call it quality for now. And to what extent do we accept English that's not perfect in terms of British norms or United States norms, but good enough to communicate? And the quality of English could be a gatekeeping tool in the sense of, for instance, contributing to paper rejections at journals. Linguistic correctness overall, sociologically speaking, can be a very powerful tool of exclusion. And I don't know about your countries, but in Poland, we tend to like correcting people or showing people that they've made a mistake, like a typo, an orthographical error, or some politicians would get ridiculed for the fact that they misspelled some kind of a rarely used word and stuff like that. And it's also very much, I think, a class marker. So you can show your class superiority, your better academic capital by correcting people. So it's not just English, but in our context, English is what we are focused on. So there's the geopolitics of bad English. And now we move to game studies specifically, and some of the things that my interviewees said last year. So, for instance, one of them spoke about the Hamburgerization or Americanization of language in game-related terms, which also makes its way into game studies terms, because terms like immersion are not terms that we have come up with ourselves in game studies, but many of the words we use we have adapted from the gaming lingo, the gaming vocabulary. So this Hamburgerization is thought to be reversible. That's one of the interviewees. Another talks about the pressure to publish exclusively in English. And yet another says that the Anglo-Saxon culture of academic writing is killing essays and that everything gets unified. Hence I thought that the irreversible pressure of unification, which is, I guess, vaguely reminiscent of the unbearable lightness of being style of things, might be a good summary of this thread from the interviews. So that's one thing. Another is from the criticism that somebody said that English is a colonizer's language, straight and simple. Another said that the United States is an academic hegemon, and this means that the hegemon is under the impression that everything about them is universal. And I haven't put that on the slides, but one Polish psychologist has recently published an article in which he and I think his colleague checked for things like, do you write where your sample comes from in quantitative studies? Do you put words like American when describing the topic of your research and the title of your paper? And of course, he's found that that scholars from the United States specify the geographical reach of their publications less than do scholars from other countries, which is, I think, a good quantitative indicator of Americanization. And of course, this is not to say that there is some kind of evil plan at work. This is not to say that people are individually evil in moral terms for doing that. It's about the general patterns of inequality that that allow some people to get away more easily with writing as if the topic was universal or as if the take was universal. So there's that. And another thing, it can be difficult for younger researchers to start publishing at this international level. And of course, the threshold isn't there for the people whose first language is English. I remember my own experiences from starting publishing in English, and I think I owe a lot to a research team that I did my postdoc in from 2020 to 2022. I still remember that when I wrote a first draft of an English paper, a draft of an introduction, and I gave it to my colleagues. The draft had a lengthy quotation at the start and some kind of general thoughts of mine about the matter, and I didn't realize that this is very much against the norm in English-speaking journals, at least in the social sciences, that you're expected to present it much more briefly, avoid longer quotes, show a few important trends in research literature, and you should do it very much differently than what you do in Polish. So I remember myself that writing in English required a significant change, and I tend to personally like writing in English to some extent. I like the kind of structure it provides, but I also feel that when I want to say something out of the line, something unusual, or structure a paper in an unusual way, there is more space for me to do this in my native language, in Polish. And that might be related to what somebody said in the interviews. You've seen it about the difficulty for essays to survive in this kind of publishing situation. So that's that. Another thread in what my interviewees said back then was that Polish was needed for newcomers or beginners. It could be students, It could be scholars who have some years of academic career under the belt, but they are only now starting to write in English, or maybe they are only now coming to being studies. You can probably see that there is a power structure here. So a beginner's language, an entry language, a novice's language, so to speak, is a language that is implied to be less valuable or less prestigious. And later on, I will show you some quotations about how English was seen as a specialist language. I'm not saying it isn't true. I'm saying it's interesting that this came up a lot, right? I have here 5 different people from my 7 interviews. So in 7 interviews, of course, it's difficult to generalize from 7 interviews, or indeed from interviews overall. But it's, say, an interesting speculation that this might be a frequent view. It might be a frequent thing that you write for beginners or as a beginner. But what's also being said here is that the English language can't replace Polish in that function. The English language can't be the language everyone uses, because you need time and skills, and I'll add a piece of good luck to be able to switch to writing in English professionally. And another thing that was said by fewer interviewees was that when you do game studies in Polish, you develop Polish terminology, and you can say different things than you would say in English. I will give one more example, maybe. In Polish, we have word nauka, which is counterpart of German Wissenschaft, which is not science. It's extremely difficult to express these same concepts in these 2 languages. Wissenschaft is something like sciences and the arts, or maybe sciences, including social sciences and humanities. But it's difficult to say this. And in game studies vocabulary, you could have similar cases where a word from one language can be fully replaced by a word from another. And if you stop using that term in your own language, then you're losing some kind of way to think about games or about game studies itself. And potentially, it could mean that you won't include some things in the games you make, because you're not thinking in a certain way, you're thinking in another way using different terms. So that's for the critique. Now for the defense. One example is from a paper where the authors dealt with an example of, let me look it up, of the case of a Chinese medical doctor who can hardly write a complete sentence in English, but regularly publishes in prestigious international journals. I think it's important that it's about a medical doctor, right? It's about medical journals. It could probably be more difficult to do that in the social sciences or the humanities, well, some parts of the social sciences, because of course there are also very quantitative areas within the social science, and to some extent humanities, though much less. But it's possible to some extent, and you could say that, okay, to some extent, translations could mitigate this difference. And one of the same authors, Ken Highland, also wrote that when we talk too much about language differences, too much about the difference between, say, native speakers and non-native speakers, what can elude us is, for instance, the role of general academic competence, and it could be easier for an experienced non-native speaker to publish things than for a native speaker who doesn't have the necessary experience. So that's one line of defense. It's a pretty influential article, that one. I think it has around 750 quotations in Google Scholar. I haven't checked them all, of course, but from the first ones, it seemed that the article is mostly being criticized. But I'm including it here as an example of a very clear defense, and the author tried to tackle head-on the topic of what he considers to be a myth of linguistic injustice. And that's the paper where he says, for instance, that native versus non-native is not the only opposition that counts. Going further, this I think is very interesting. Anna Krystyna Hultgren has written at least 2 papers about how focusing on language, which is what I'm doing right now, might mean that we turn our sight away from certain underlying economic, political, or social causes. And I think it's a valid criticism, for instance, in the sense that talking about language alone won't tell us much about how corporate publishers are making knowledge much less available than it could be, and how they're making incredible profit margins, sometimes like 30% of profit margin per year. There was an article in The Guardian by Stephen Burani, I think the name was something like, "Is it a staggeringly profitable publishing business bet for science?" And you can guess the answer to this question according to the author. So I think there is something very, very significant here, but you need to focus on something. And today I'm focusing on language. And to another thing, it is my impression from reading up on some academic literature that usually people go into one of 2 camps. One camp is criticizing the English language and suggesting implicitly or explicitly that local languages or regional languages or local uses of language are simply better because they are in a lower hierarchical position. So the dominating language is a valid object for criticism. The languages that are less powerful, not so much. And the other camp would be people like here, noting that we have a resurgence of nationalism, and national ideas are getting more and more visible, more and more powerful. In the previous presentation of the morning, I showed Donald Trump and David Cameron from 2016, the year of Brexit, also the year of Donald Trump's electoral victory. I probably should have done that here too. Maybe I will add it to the version of the website. As an example of neo-nationalism, this is a book about neo-nationalism in academia and about reforms, for instance, in research evaluation reforms, how many points you get for articles, and so on. Reforms aimed at de-internationalizing academia, so to speak, or de-Englishizing it. But in Denmark, for instance, they use terms like de-internationalization. And indeed, in Denmark, they had a situation a few years ago where a conservatively oriented government forcibly, there were negotiations, but essentially it made universities in Denmark reduce the numbers of places available to English-speaking, not Danish-speaking students at universities. The current government is trying to reverse that. We'll see how it goes. But this is an example of how you can defend English by showing that it doesn't always win. It can be replaced to some extent. In Poland, what we had was that a right-wing minister of science and higher education increased the point scores in the Polish journal rating of a number of journals that were locally rather than internationally oriented. It doesn't automatically mean that this was solely politically motivated, but it was a market turn, at least for some time, a market turn away from the strategy to valorize international English language journals and a turn toward valorizing local journals and Polish language more. So there's that. And I guess that when you have these 2 camps, an interesting way to position yourself might be to try to look at the dangers on both sides. So there are dangers associated with corporate publishers and hegemonic English, and there are dangers associated with what they call neo-nationalism. And it might be nice to see both these things at the same time. I think there is not that much research literature about it, but I think it's probably about to. And one more thing, interviews with gay scholars from Poland. So English as a global language, a defense, and I'd like to point you to the fact that there are phrases like, of course, when you publish in English, our publications reach incomparably more people. It is known that English is a global language. I agree, it is known, of course, but it's interesting that people should use this phrase here and not necessarily everywhere else. So there is this line of argument that, yeah, when you publish in English, you can reach a bigger audience. And I have a similar thing with my own stuff in gay studies, of course. If I hadn't co-published about Polish history, Polish games, and Polish historical games in English, then I couldn't show this paper to probably maybe most people who are interested. Although you could say that by publishing in English, I have made it less likely, or we have made it less likely for people in Poland to be able to find out about our work. But then again, it's not just individual decisions. Apart from these individual considerations and what audience is going to be the best, you also have considerations regarding how many points my minister has assigned to this journal and that journal, and how many points do I need to stay safe, and when can I start publishing things without taking this point factor into consideration. Yeah. Another thread, another metaphor is that the English language could be a bridge. I think it's a very interesting defense. Essentially, what's being said here is that people from more peripheral places in game studies could come to a conference, they could write to a journal, they have a chance of being heard, because if they speak in English, it may be difficult for them, but they could be read. And if they spoke and wrote only in the national language, and these were languages without a powerful position in the global linguistic hierarchy, then nobody would pay attention to this. And I think it's a serious argument. I think it's worth considering. So English as a sort of bridge and a way for people to find out what's going on in various regions. And I've already mentioned this thread, English as a language for specialists, as opposed to Polish as an entry-level language for game studies. So I'm not going to dwell on it much, maybe. Multilingualism. Maybe that's a way out. There are works using the term multilingualism, like here, multilingualism within scholarly communication in the social sciences and humanities. This is the SSH. And in works like this, people are saying the social sciences and humanities are multilingual. They have been multilingual. They will continue to be multilingual at least for a time. They are often tied to national traditions. Of course, not all social sciences. Psychology probably less than say political science. But there is generally speaking, there is a tie stronger here than in STEM or the natural sciences. And the argument here is that we should recognize it, and we should create institutional conditions in which multilingual communication can still be a thing. Here we have a post from London School of Economics' blog. And one of the arguments that people are making here is that, think COVID, for instance, and think about journalists who wanted to access professional information about vaccines in academic journals. I'm sure there are still journalists who reach out to these journals and who encountered a language barrier. And not all of them were first proficient enough, and second, able to find a way around the paywalls. And so it seems to be at least a reasonable hypothesis that when you don't have multilingual publication in academia, you lose significant opportunities to reach maybe not the entire public, but at least the segments of the public, like journalists or some journalists, who might work as intermediaries in getting information across to people. And I suppose that the pandemic might be the starkest example in recent years, but climate change, for instance, or climate catastrophe could be another example where this kind of information convenience seems to be important. Hello. There is an idea that in the current age of AIs, we might use machine translations to create new possibilities for multilingual communication. So if a colleague of mine has written something in Hungarian and I can't say one word in Hungarian, then I can at least preliminarily translate this, and maybe I will learn something, and maybe I can write an email to them and ask for some details. So that's possible. There are still dangers here. For instance, bigger languages may have better large language models, which might mean that these languages maintain their powerful position instead of there being more equality. So it's not everything clear cut. But yeah, I thought I would show that people are writing papers also about how translations might be a tool to be used in service of multilingualism. And one of my interviewees shared with me the experience that when he was telling people about his publications in Polish, they would just wave the hand and, okay, it's in Polish, I will never read it. Whereas they could, to a reasonable extent, get acquainted with the general thought using the translation tools. I remember translating parts of my PhD with DeepL from Polish to English, and I did have to spend some time polishing it up, polishing my English, polishing DeepL's English, but overall I was surprised by how good it was as a way to communicate this part of my research to other people in my team who didn't speak Polish. So I have that experience. Yeah, and maybe that's a bit optimistic, but something that was also very frequent in my interviews, as far as we can talk about frequency in this kind of study, was the idea that, as one person put it, imperialism has its merits, and nationalism also has its merits, right? To God the things that are God's, to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So the idea that there is a place for Polish and English in the picture, or you could say Spanish and English, German and English, and that these languages could complement one another. So there's that idea too. And now we're coming to the conclusions. I like to think about the current situation as a way between the two mythological monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, who can both devour you if you're not careful. So one monster in that image would be corporate publishers, hegemonic English, serious gatekeeping journals, and so on and so on. The other monster would be neo-nationalist tendencies, like a right-wing minister using his power to single-handedly alter some parts of the research evaluation system. So there are these two monsters, but it's not all there is. There are other things too. And first of all, something I said before, and something again Victor said in the introduction, is that there's not just one English. This also means that publishing in English doesn't mean that I serve Scylla. It doesn't mean that I steer toward the monster. There are many ways to use English, many motivations, and also the context can be quite interesting, I think. For instance, I'm toying with the thought that maybe English is particularly attractive for the people who don't have what we might call starting academic capital, in the sense that you haven't had contacts with academics before the level of your PhD studies, for instance. Your parents haven't been professors. You don't know how things are done. You don't know the soft rules. You don't know how to pour the wine. You don't know all these things. But here, there is at least a promise that the English language, a point system for publications, a grant system, and so on, all these parts of the system, there is a promise that you just need to learn some measurable skills that it's enough for you to be sufficiently good in things that can be verbalized. It's not that you need to have this tacit knowledge which only comes from having academic parents, for instance. This promise doesn't necessarily have to be true, and it could be that the grant system creates its own inequalities. At lunch today, we were talking about how when you get one grant or when you get funding for 1 or 2 trips abroad, then you're more likely to get more trips and more and more and more. That's St. Matthew's rule as its finest. So take from the one who doesn't have anything and add for and give to someone who has a lot. So there's that too. But I think that promise might possibly maybe explain some part of the support for the reforms associated with the English language, the changes in the evaluation systems, and so on. It would be an interesting research question to look at class backgrounds of academics and see if there is a relation between class background and attitudes to all the reforms emphasizing the English language, bonds, grants, and so on. So that's one thing. Then one interesting thing I didn't think about for a long time, which I guess uncovers my own prejudices or biases, is that English can be like in India. Of course, there are many languages spoken in India, but English in India doesn't have the same hegemonic role as English in the United States or the United Kingdom, for instance, or the journals, some journals based in the United States or the United Kingdom. So it's not enough to say, again, English is a hegemonic language. There are Englishes. And in game studies too, there is DIGRA India, and it's different to use English in Digital Games Research Association Indian chapter than to use English in, say, influential journals based in the Anglosphere. Then again, I come from Central and Eastern Europe. We have an annual conference. There was a keynote speaker, one of the keynote speakers last year, Central Eastern European Game Studies Conference, SEEKS. We have a chapter of the Digital Games Research Association for Central and Eastern Europe, and our working language is English. 35 years ago, probably it could have been Russian, but we're not 35 years ago, and I'm not going to go into the Russian topic much for obvious reasons. It's not very likely to come back as a joint language in this part of Europe. And this means that we don't have a common language unless it's English. Or maybe in 60 years' time, it will be something different. Maybe it'll be Chinese, who knows? But I can talk to my colleagues from Slovakia, from the Czech Republic, and so on, or I can talk to you here now. And there is some potential, I think, for what you might call the solidarity of the peripheries or semi-peripheries. So again, the English language could be used in a non-hegemonic role, so to speak. And one last thing that I think is interesting, though not related to game studies, is that there is a journal published in Latin America called Tapuya. It's in the field of science and technology studies, STS, and it's designed as a language that uses English to present the work of scholars with whose main language is Spanish or Portuguese. And it's designed as a way to make this kind of knowledge more accessible to people outside Latin America or inside Latin America than it might be in other situations. That might be if there were no such a journal. So again, you can play with English if you like. You can look for different ways to use it. And also, that other monster, Charybdis, you don't necessarily serve Charybdis, or you don't sail into Charybdis more. I should probably decide on one of those metaphors, right? Serving or falling into the maw. You don't serve Charybdis if you publish in your own language. There can be scores of motivations for you to publish. We've seen some of those motivations in the slides before, like wanting for your work to be available to a broad, potentially broad segment of the world population. And also you can have a language that's not English, that is international. So Spanish language is definitely available to people here and to people in Hispanic America, for instance. It's not English, it is international. At the same time, it is a language that's being used nationally. By the way, an interesting thing about Hispanic America, there is a researcher, Carolina Guzman Valenzuela, and she calculated that there was surprisingly little collaboration, little co-authorship between people from various countries in Hispanic America. So think Mexico and Chile, or Paraguay and Uruguay. There was surprisingly little collaboration, despite the fact that there was a common language. And I will be going to Chile in a few months to try to understand it, at least a little bit, or at least to see, I think it's more accurate how people in Chile understand it, maybe try to learn from them. I think that's more accurate. But one idea I had to explain this was when I was reading Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, a book on nationalism, where he writes that previously, before the 19th century, there were administrative regions in South America, and press circulations, for instance, were often confined within these administrative regions. And so the process of creating the feeling that we are one community, even though we often haven't met one another, the feeling that we are one nation, as it will later be called, was largely limited to the confines of one administrative region, rather than spill out into the surrounding regions. So I'm mentioning this as an interesting example, I think, of how language itself doesn't mean that there will be collaboration, and that's also something to take into consideration. And here I've linked a recording of a conversation about the relationship between Spanish and English and the institutions and structures that support both these languages. Quite recent, from late April. That's recorded in Spanish. And getting close to the end. Language is weak in itself. If you don't have organizations, institutions, journals, networks, I think we could talk about language all day, but it won't be enough. So if we want to maybe turn this into some practical considerations, then one practical consideration would be, how can we band up? What can we do? Can we create a network of people? Can we have online seminars? Can we have panels at Digital Games Research Association's conferences? Can we talk about this in Mataro? And stuff like that. So that's one thing to say. Another thing that might be somewhat specific to game studies is that I don't have quantitative data, but it does seem from conferences, for instance, from participation distributions, that there are a lot of people whose native language is not English in international game studies, if you will. That might be related to the history of game studies as a field, because organizationally, institutionally, the field of game studies appeared, I think, around a quarter century ago, or at least the strongest institutionalization by the time was in the Nordic countries. And it wasn't just one country, but it was people from Norway, Finland, also the Netherlands, Denmark, working together using English. And I think that's also the reason why we have the Game Studies Journal as a Diamond Open Access journal. So, it was founded in 2001. it still is an open access journal and there are no article processing charges, which means you don't need to, or your institution doesn't need to pay for publication or doesn't need to pay for open access. It is supported financially, the journal, by various institutions from the Nordic countries. And I think it would be difficult to set up a journal now that would function outside the paywall circulation, so to speak, that would be as important as game studies has grown to be. So that's another thing maybe to think about regarding the history of game studies as a field. And that's another example of how the English language has been used in the field of game studies in a way that I don't know if I should call it non-hegemonic, but in a way that didn't necessarily favor people from a small set of countries that much. Although you could undermine that and say, well, you still have better chances if you're from Norway than when you're from Ukraine, because in Norway, for a host of reasons, many more people speak English well, and yeah, it's not as easy as hegemonic, non-hegemonic. But I think there is a tradition in game studies that has a potential that could be fostered for escaping similar periods. And I suppose the big question is, can we find ways to harmonize the uses of English, the uses of national languages or regional languages, make things written in languages other than English more accessible? And in early July, there will be a conference of the Digital Games Research Association, a central conference this year, and Bruno and I will be attending among others. And we have a discussion panel where we will try to talk about these things. Like there will be several short papers and also some questions which I've posted on that last slide. And these are pretty practical questions that I think could be important even today, even without all this talk and all these considerations about network. So, do we consider creating and sharing knowledge in English more valuable than in other languages? Why? Do we need to have a single language, like a common language to communicate, or can it be, like, is there a viable alternative? What can we do practically, for instance, in terms of translations? Should we maybe try to direct funds to translating things, or create databases for translated game studies stuff? Should we focus on, I think, what I called before, the collaboration, the solidarity of the peripheries or semi-peripheries, or should we focus on bursting the bubble? So should we try to take over the existing currently prestigious journals, or should we try to create our own circuits? A very practical question for me. What citation politics should I follow as an author, as a reviewer, as an editor? So an author sends to me, or I get a manuscript for review, an article for review, and it has a lot of literature in languages that I don't know. What do I do? Is there a procedure for that? I can't verify all this, but I probably shouldn't suggest the author to just throw everything out and replace it with English language references. So what do I do as a reviewer or as an author? If I have space only for one reference, do I go for a less known reference in my own language that's often not easily accessible to people who speak English? Maybe it's not even digitized because it's a book in Polish. Or do I go for an existing English language publication that is more accessible? It will serve its function better in the sense that more people will have access to it in the target journal. But citation politics is important. That Polish author I could have cited won't get citations. And it's not just quantity, but it's also recognition. And maybe I do have some kind of debt toward my own academic field. Maybe I do have some kind of debt toward Polish game studies and Polish language works. So I think it's a practical question. Recently, a colleague has told me that she's seen that one journal in Canada, I think, has adopted the policy of not including references in article word counts, and the rationale was that if you include references in article word counts, then you create an incentive for people to cut out references to make the article fit into the word limit. And what do they cut out first? Do they cut out first prestigious, highly cited English language publications, or do they cut out first their own national publications? And even simple things like when I put a reference in Polish on a paper, I would like to at least give a translation of the title so that people know what it is about and they can decide whether to Google it further or whatever. But a translation of the title could be another 10 words. And if you've ever written a paper that was supposed to be 6,000 words long at the most, and you wanted to have 10,000 words, and you are like madly scraping all the words you could you could manage to destroy, killing your darlings, as they say, then you know what I'm talking about here. And the very last thing, how much or how little emphasis should there be on correct English? Let's say I'm a reviewer for a conference, somebody sends in an abstract for a talk, and the quality of English, as I see it, is not very good, but I understand the abstract. Should I write anything about the language? Should I even comment on it? It's not just about whether I should make it a criterion of acceptance, but should I like mention it? Should I say something? Maybe if I say something, it will point the author towards some ways to improve the language, but I would need to be fairly specific. If I just say, oh, your English is bad, go away. It doesn't help anyone, right? So maybe I shouldn't comment on it at all. But there is probably some kind of cutoff point. So at what point does English become unrecognizable? Like at what point does it lose its communicative function, and at what point should I say that, well, sorry, this abstract, this submission for the conference is just not understandable, sorry. So there are questions like this, and I feel like they are, at least in my academic practice, they are coming up more and more often. And these are the questions I want to end with. Thank you for bearing with me and the different languages. Muchas gracias. Danke sehr. Dziękuję bardzo. Thanks.